Hello, art lovers and those that are obsessed by art. This is Art Obsession Studios. I want to talk to you about underpainting. In a previous video, I mentioned something about black underpainting, but I kind of briefly touched on it. And I may have inadvertently put it down a little bit, but I didn't mean to. And like I said after in the same video, it is a beautiful process. But what I was warning against is if everybody goes out and starts painting their canvas black for whatever reason, and then that's their underpainting and they just go with that. If that's all you ever do, it's not really going to be the thing that determines your style. And that's really what I was getting at. But I want to talk about the importance and the non-importance of it. There is no real rule book. You're going to hear people tell you that, well, if you want a nice warm landscape, you use like a raw sienna. Burnt sienna, I should say. Raw sienna would be a little closer to ochre. But burnt sienna it's a nice reddish kind of terracotta kind of feel. And it's warm. The other one is going with, like you can see here, this big canvas in the background. It's painted red. It's ready to go. I've got a small panel here too, which I've back painted cadmium red, or it's a deep red anyway. It's supposed to be based on a cadmium red, but it's not quite as pure and good. And you can use a lot of different products to do that. But just before I get into that, let's talk about why you would do it and why some people have done it. It's been going on for many hundreds of years, but for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes using a white canvas and just having splotches of white showing through is very undesirable. The thing about that is if you paint in your thin applications of paint, you will have this white coming through, especially with thin applications of paint. So an underpainting is kind of like a primer. It's a background behind whatever it is that you're going to layer over top of that. And back in the day, I suppose, making your own paints or your own pigments, there was probably some economy in the decision to underpaint in certain tones. And because of the materials that are required for making your own paints, some of them are from gemstone and are very hard to get at. Other natural ingredients that are organic, for instance, that can be very difficult to get at, like a root or rose madder or stuff like this, where you actually take it from the roots of plants, whether or not you bake those roots first and then dry them and grind them into a pigment. There's even one where they're using its fleas or ticks or something of aphids from some cactus, and you're taking these and crushing them up, and they're producing this red. There are the stones that produce the cobalt and that which is used for French ultramarine. These blue stones can be very, very expensive. They have to be crushed and milled and ground up into fine powders. It's a lot of work, which is almost a different, we could branch into that as a different topic, but for some people that's really important. They want to be there from the grassroots all the way up and create a painting from pigments that they've collected and gathered in the environment around them, or maybe procured through some remote areas, because some of these blues, for instance, come from very special, unique places in the world. You can't just walk out in your driveway and find some blue stones. So it's something that you really have to be prepared to either travel or have somebody else travel and collect for you. In those cases, in those olden day cases, grinding these pigments up and then mixing them with an egg tempura to make an egg tempura medium painting. Sometimes there's a lot of translucency in the paints. So an underpainting was very important. So if you wanted a dark and sort of that heavy portrait, you know, where just the light from the lamps or the natural light coming in through the window of the old castle is lighting the noble's face, and maybe the features of their beautiful gown that they're wearing or whatever, you may want that backdrop to be hints of very dark, deep ruby and stuff like this, you know, that were just subliminally in behind. So definitely we would want to back paint that canvas or underpaint that canvas before applying the finish pigments for that effect back in those days. I think when the tubed paints came along, then the pigmentation had increased dramatically. The permanence and the quality control of the tubed product was no longer in the hands of the individual artist. It was being produced by these companies. And gosh, I forget again who did the first tubes. I used to know these things and I just let go of them over the years. But when those tubes came along, this was really where the impressionists and the tube paint came together. And we see underpainting then taking on a completely different direction, and it becomes not so much a function of the finished product, but part of the style, it's part of the approach. And you can see in this painting here, and I consider myself an impressionist painter. This painting was done with a black underpainted canvas. So why? Well, it's night or twilight. It's not completed, by the way. I still have some details to go. But it is twilight in this dark light. Working with it was perfect because I can ignore the shadows in certain areas, and they're just automatically going to be exactly the way that I wanted them to be. So it can speak a little bit about one's style, perhaps. I wouldn't want to be identified, though, strictly because of how I underpainted canvas. And I think that is what I was trying to say when I first mentioned it. If you were in search of a style, maybe underpainting is not necessarily the path to your own unique style. After all, everyone can do it, and a lot of people do it. In fact, I think that the black canvas as an underpaint has been almost overdone. And again, there I go saying that, but not to criticize it, because it's a beautiful product. I do it, and I will continue to a black underpaint. I'm sorry, I look over here and I look over there on my, using an iPhone. And I never know where the lens is. So anyways, it's not wrong. It's never wrong. But if you're searching for your style and who you are and trying to identify yourself as an artist, it's going to be more in the way that you apply the paint to the painting that you're working on, the subject matter that just pulls you in, and it commands, it makes it compulsory that you paint. You just have to paint. So those are the things that are going to shine through. Being innovative and being innovative and creative with how that underpainting works, putting it in just where you wanted it to be rather than underpainting the entire canvas or the panel. Like I've done in one of my videos, I show you how I did the Great Cedar, and you can see that that's a form of underpainting. Instead of doing the entire canvas like this one, all in red, I just put in the drawing of what I wanted, a very bold brush, and this is where the tree is going to be, and this is where the foliage is going to be in this red, and used a lot of it, didn't spare a drop. And so now I know that when I'm finished, I'll have that red peeking through. And on a bright sunny day with the greens of the evergreens and the smells of that fir coming through when you stand there and look at the forests, having those little warm peaks coming through and glowing from behind the bark at you. No, that's, that is beautiful, I think, right, in my opinion. So again, a night scene, I black underpaint. That's probably going to be some kind of a landscape, I would imagine. I'm thinking ahead. I think that's what it's going to be. It could be anything. I could even change the underpainting slightly and use something else. And then, like, I have already done that with a smaller panel here too. It's ready to go. But I've used different underpainting colors, and I've used stuff like the burnt sienna, and I've used the red. I even used Viridian once, which I thought would be really interesting, but then in the end, you couldn't really appreciate that I had used anything. And so I thought, was I wasting my time? And perhaps I was. And that's what you have to think about, is how much paint do you apply? What is your style of painting anyways? This is what you have to find out. What do I like to do? Maybe you just start underpainting just because you want to get something on the canvas or the panel. And then you're going to add to it. Maybe the underpainting forms a part of your finished product. And in that case, keep on underpainting. But explore different colors. Doing a winter scene, for instance, where it's lightly snowing and maybe you have some outbuildings, some barns and things, I would actually recommend going with something like a magenta or some kind of a violet or purple undertone. Because I've always gotten the feel when I'm sitting there and it's getting toward twilight or whatever, and it's lightly snowing and I'm looking out at buildings and stuff, that there's almost this pinky purpley hue to the atmosphere. I don't know why, but it's my thing. Whatever your thing is, and maybe that's your underpainting. So again, if you're going with dark, very, moody, you want the contrast and to create that, or you intentionally want to show lines, linear distinctions, or distinctions in no matter what shapes, whether they're cylindrical, spherical, rectangular, whatever. And you want to show the distinction between that and the background, or where the other object, one ends, one begins. Because you may have a collection of vases with different sizes of bush, and if you try and just paint that as an impressionist, it just looks like a blob of stuff. Whereas if you have a black underpainting or red underpainting, each vase that you've painted is distinguishable from the next because of this little border line that you've left behind. So that is a very functional way of using an underpainting. So the other way again is to have those hints come through when you're working with thin applications of paint, that you've thinned them out and you're trying to be very economical with paint. Strongly recommend going with underpainting in that case, because you'll have too much white canvas glowing through. So you definitely want to be using an underpainting to get through those. So again, be creative though. Make it your own thing, and don't just stick with one or the other, because the underpainting on itself is not, or on it by itself, is not really going to determine your style. And it won't distinguish you dramatically from anyone else in the group. If I walk into a gallery today, and we will, at some point I'll go touring and bring the camera, I can show you a lot of paintings that were a black undertone or a black underpainted. And again, like I say, it's like, there's something here that's indistinguishable from the other artist. But if I see something from one artist and the underpainting has been changed according to the subject matter, but the approach, the style, the placement of the paint, you can see the energy in the brush strokes. Did they work them over a little bit? Did they go fast with the brush stroke? Did they go slow? Were they purposeful, intentional? Are they minimum brush strokes? Or are there, lots of smaller brush strokes for detail? And whatever their approach was, not right or wrong, just unique to them, that becomes their artistic signature. And I can tell no matter what the underpainting. So the underpainting, not necessarily your style. I hope I've been clear about that. Next, let's talk about what kind of paint makes an underpaint. What could you use? Well, when we look at canvas, we're looking at a piece of fabric, linen, like cotton, and it's been coated with what's known as gesso, which is really, for all intents and purposes, gesso is a water-based paint. And that's kind of the modern underpaint or the prep that you're going to get on canvas anyway at the store. Some people paint right over top of that. I, for one, have painted over a lot of white canvas. I have no problem. I use a lot of paint. So depending upon the scene, I will do that. When I do night scenes like this, I tend to want to underpaint black. Already said that. But with the white, there's different approaches to that. Some people want it really smooth. They don't want the canvas to be too gnarly and have bumps in it. They'll actually take sandpaper, pre-sand the canvas. That means sanding the surface of this canvas and then repainting it with more gesso to smooth it out. My answer to those folks is to get panels, and you can get smooth like masonite panels, and you can paint those panels. In fact, you can actually buy them at the art store, and they have a very smooth paint surface on them. You could paint those, and I would almost suggest, if as smooth as what you really need, I would get them sprayed. And if you don't have a sprayer yourself, maybe go to a painter and say, here's a dozen of these. Could you just spray these for me and pay them $100 or whatever, $50, whatever they're charging you. And there your panels are ready to go. And when you're doing photorealism, that's probably a direction that you want to go in, because you want them very, very smooth. Now, you might still want to underpaint, go ahead, but now you're going to have some brush strokes in there. So again, if photorealism, maybe you don't want that, maybe you do, I don't know. I don't do photorealism. I played with it a little bit in the past, little things like do an eyeball, do it really, really accurately. But anyway, other things that you can do, you can buy just acrylic paint at your paint store, use that. I have some black product there. Make sure it's the right, don't buy a high gloss. I highly recommend you don't do that, because there's too much silicones in the high gloss acrylic paints, and your oil paints will not stick to that as well as you would like, and they could peel or scuff with the slightest little rub if they are rubbed, and that would be terrible if you had a very high-end gallery piece that you finished and it suddenly had a tear. The oil paint tore off of the underpaint. So I would use nothing beyond eggshell. I would go with flat to eggshell at the very highest luster and paint over top of that. And you could even, if it is a gloss, then scuff it with some sandpaper and wipe it with a damp cloth afterwards to take away that residue. But do this again thinking about breathing in. You want to protect yourself. Anytime you sand a painted surface, protect your breathing passages. You don't know what was in that paint before it went on the product. All right, always assume the worst. So that with underpainting, it can even be your oil paints. Now, if you do oil paints, you're just say, I don't have any acrylics and I don't want acrylics. Here's liquid. Now, I would use liquid anytime I want my paint to set up really fast, because I absolutely have to get back on top of that painting and put in some detail. Kind of like in here where I was working on the branches. I put this painting aside for a few days so that I can finish some of the detail in the shop window. There's a little more detail, and I just really wanted to represent, they have some nice clothing in this store, so I kind of want to represent some of those colors and textures that they have in that through that window as best I can with my brush, and some of these branches, and put some snow on them. In that case, I didn't use this, but I could have used liquid when I did the sky, just to accelerate it, and this makes sure that your paint dries very fast. So if you are going to underpaint in oil paint, I suggest that you use some liquid. Mix some of that in with your paint, just like a thinning medium you would. Don't mix too much of it in. You know, at the most, maybe 20–25% liquid to the paint. I wouldn't go beyond that at all. Try and keep it that number or lower. And then just brush that on. And sit your painting aside somewhere where it's warm. And heat seems to really accelerate the whole process. And absolutely the next day you're painting over top of it without any issues. And in fact, I've seen liquid and this process with certain paints take as little as you know, somewhere between 4 and 6 hours, and you're good to go. And there is some debate over what paint sets up faster than others. I heard someone say Prussian blue, but I've not found that. Burnt umber by far is the first paint on my palette to take off and goes off like firecrackers. It just sets right up. It's like it's got a natural accelerator in it or something. So liquid, if you need to just stick with oils on oils and that's all you wanted to do, then, you know, mix a little bit of that for your underpaint. And that way your underpaint won't blend up with what other colors you're putting on. Okay, so I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of underpainting and what it's all about. How it works, why it works. And just to finish on that note, I was at the gallery the other day. I saw someone who intentionally did not underpaint when they left part of the white canvas as part of their final work. Go figure. So kind of like that unfinished George Washington painting that's so famous, right? We got a little bit of the white left behind. It's like, fine, leave it. Okay, whatever you want to do, take that rule book and just burn it. Throw it in the fire, because there is no rules. All right? There'll only be rules when it comes to strict chemical reactions and things with colors, the way they react with each other. That's the only thing there's a strict rule about. How you put it on, what you do for an underpainting or no underpainting, is completely up to you. Don't depend on it for your style. You may find that a lot of people are doing it, and a lot of us artists do underpaint. I think most of us do, and so it's not really unique is what I'm saying. But it is a beautiful thing, and used appropriately, it can create, you know, some very impressive results. They'll make you feel good anyway. That's what's impressive. Thank you. And please, I need more subscribers on this channel to make it worthwhile, to produce art videos and to teach people art and how to paint, or just some of my crazy ideas or takes on painting. And so if you subscribe, you'll be helping the channel out. And if you give it a thumbs up, that also helps other people to find the channel so that they can see what's going on and you can share it. And do share, by the way, because I don't do a lot of promotion. I don't have access to that, or, well, I don't know what to say. I just like painting, and I have a camera around once in a while.